You think Vikings just ate whatever they could catch during their brutal ocean voyages, but they actually developed food preservation techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. When most sailors were dying of starvation and scurvy during long expeditions, Vikings had mastered methods for keeping food fresh and nutritious for months at sea. Here's what sounds completely impossible. Vikings could make meat last over a year without refrigeration, turn spoiled food back into safe meals, and even create nutritious superfood that provided more energy than modern protein bars. All using nothing but materials they could find on their ships or raid from coastal settlements. But Vikings didn't just survive their legendary voyages. They thrived because they understood food science in ways that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 800 years. They developed 6 revolutionary preservation methods that kept their crews strong and healthy during raids across the North Atlantic, Mediterranean, and even into North America. I've studied Norse sagas, archaeological evidence from shipwrecks, and historical accounts from across Scandinavia and beyond. What I discovered about Viking food preservation will completely change how you think about medieval survival skills and maritime nutrition. The challenge Vikings faced was absolutely brutal. A typical longship carried 30 to 80 warriors on voyages that could last 6 months or more. Each man needed 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily to maintain strength for rowing, fighting, and surviving in harsh conditions. That's potentially 320,000 calories needed per day for a full crew. Fresh food spoiled within days in the damp, salty conditions of a Viking ship. Stored grain attracted rats and developed deadly mold. Meat rotted so quickly it became poisonous. Without reliable food preservation, Viking expeditions would have been impossible, and European history would have been completely different. Vikings had to solve this problem or watch their legendary raids end in starvation and death. In this video, I'm going to reveal the 6 methods Vikings used to preserve food aboard their ships. From ancient fermentation techniques to ingenious smoking systems that worked at sea, these innovations kept Viking crews fed and fighting ready across the known world. Method 1. The salt curing mastery. The first and most crucial technique Vikings perfected was salt curing, but this wasn't just covering meat with salt and hoping for the best. Vikings developed sophisticated salt curing methods that could preserve massive quantities of meat and fish for over a year while maintaining nutritional value and preventing deadly spoilage. Here's how their system worked. Vikings used different grades of salt for different preservation needs. Coarse sea salt was used for initial curing of large meat cuts, while fine salt was reserved for delicate fish and final preservation stages. But the real innovation was in their curing ratios and timing. Vikings discovered that different meats required different salt-to-meat ratios for optimal preservation. Beef needed about 3 pounds of salt per 10 pounds of meat, while fish required only 2 pounds per 10 pounds. Pork fell somewhere in between, and each type had specific timing requirements for maximum preservation. The preparation process was incredibly systematic. Vikings would first clean and butcher their meat into specific sizes, not random cuts, but carefully calculated pieces that would cure evenly and completely. Large pieces took too long to cure and often spoiled in the center, while pieces that were too small lost too much moisture and became inedible. Temperature and humidity control was crucial, even on ships. Vikings learned to position their curing operations in the coolest, driest parts of their vessels. They'd often cure meat during cooler weather or in northern waters, where lower temperatures improved the curing process and reduced spoilage risks. Quality testing was sophisticated for its time. Vikings developed techniques for determining when meat was properly cured. They'd test small pieces by taste, smell, and texture. Properly cured meat had a specific feel and appearance that indicated complete salt penetration and safe preservation. The storage systems were engineered for ship conditions. Vikings used specially designed barrels with tight-fitting lids and drainage systems that allowed excess moisture to escape while preventing contamination. These barrels were positioned in the ship's hold where they'd remain stable during rough seas. Rehydration techniques were equally important. Vikings knew that salt-cured meat needed proper preparation before eating. They'd soak cured meat in fresh water or weak beer for hours to remove excess salt and restore palatability. The soaking liquid was often saved and used for cooking other foods. The scale was impressive. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows salt-curing operations that could preserve thousands of pounds of meat and fish. A single successful raid could provide enough preserved protein to feed a crew for months of subsequent voyaging. Specialized tools were developed for salt-curing operations. Vikings used specific knives for cutting meat to optimal sizes, wooden paddles for mixing salt, and testing tools for checking cure progress. These tools were considered as important as weapons for successful voyaging. But salt curing required massive amounts of salt, which was expensive and took up precious cargo space. For situations where salt was scarce, Vikings turned to their second method, one that used the power of smoke to preserve food. Method 2. The shipboard smoking systems. Vikings developed ingenious smoking systems that could operate safely aboard wooden ships, turning their vessels into floating smokehouses that could preserve meat and fish during active voyages. This wasn't just building fires and hoping for the best. It was sophisticated food processing that required careful engineering and constant attention. The smoking apparatus was designed specifically for ship use. Vikings created enclosed smoking chambers using wooden boxes lined with metal plates to prevent fires. These chambers had carefully designed ventilation systems that controlled airflow, temperature, and smoke density while preventing dangerous heat buildup that could ignite the ship. But here's where Viking innovation really showed. They developed different smoking techniques for different preservation needs. Cold smoking at low temperatures preserved food for long-term storage, while hot smoking cooked food immediately and provided shorter-term preservation. Vikings could switch between techniques based on their immediate needs and available fuel. The fuel selection was crucial and surprisingly sophisticated. Vikings discovered that different woods produced different flavors and preservation qualities. Oak created dense, long-lasting smoke, ideal for long-term preservation. Birch produced lighter smoke that worked well for fish. Apple and other fruit woods were prized for their flavor-enhancing properties. Fire management was a life-or-death skill. Vikings had to maintain consistent smoking temperatures for 12 to 24 hours while preventing their wooden ships from catching fire. They developed techniques for banking fires, controlling airflow, and managing fuel consumption that kept smoking operations running safely around the clock. The food preparation was systematic. Vikings would pre-treat meat and fish with salt brines before smoking to improve preservation and flavor. They'd cut food into specific sizes and shapes that would smoke evenly and completely. The arrangement of food in smoking chambers was carefully planned to ensure proper smoke circulation. Safety protocols were extensive. Vikings assigned dedicated fire watches during smoking operations, maintained emergency water supplies, and developed procedures for quickly extinguishing smoking fires if weather conditions became dangerous. Smoking operations were often suspended during storms or high winds. Portable systems were developed for smaller vessels. Vikings created compact smoking setups that could be used on smaller boats or during shore expeditions. These portable smokers could preserve fresh catches or hunted game quickly and efficiently. The production capacity was substantial. A well-designed shipboard smoking system could preserve 200 to 300 pounds of meat or fish in a single smoking cycle, providing protein for a crew of 50 men for several weeks. But smoking required constant fuel and careful fire management that wasn't always practical during active sailing or combat. For preservation methods that worked without fire, Vikings turned to their third technique, one that used natural fermentation processes. Method 3. The controlled fermentation techniques. Vikings mastered controlled fermentation processes that could preserve food for months while actually improving its nutritional value. This wasn't accidental spoilage. It was deliberate food science that created preserved foods with enhanced vitamins, minerals, and digestibility that kept crews healthier than fresh food alone. The fermentation containers were specially designed for ship use. Vikings used wooden barrels and ceramic pots with specific shapes and sizes that promoted proper fermentation while preventing contamination. These containers had tight-fitting lids with small vents that allowed fermentation gases to escape while keeping harmful bacteria out. But the real sophistication was in their starter cultures. Vikings maintained living fermentation cultures that they carried from voyage to voyage, like sourdough starters that could last for years. These cultures contained beneficial bacteria and yeasts that ensured consistent, safe fermentation results even in the challenging conditions aboard ships. The timing was precisely calculated. Vikings knew exactly how long different foods needed to ferment for optimal preservation and nutrition. Cabbage required 2 to 3 weeks for proper sauerkraut fermentation, while grain-based fermentations needed 4 to 6 weeks for full development. The nutritional benefits were remarkable. Fermented foods provided vitamins that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases that killed sailors on other vessels. Vikings understood that fermented foods were easier to digest and provided more energy than fresh foods, though they didn't understand the scientific reasons. The cultural knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted. Fermentation techniques were taught from generation to generation, with experienced Vikings training younger crew members in the subtle arts of managing fermentation cultures and recognizing successful preservation. But fermentation took weeks to complete and required careful monitoring that wasn't always possible during active raiding. For faster preservation methods, Vikings developed their fourth technique, one that used the ocean itself as a preservation tool. Method 4. The seawater preservation system. Vikings discovered that seawater could be used as a powerful preservation medium when properly managed and controlled. This wasn't just throwing food into the ocean. It was a sophisticated system that used seawater's natural salt content and mineral composition to preserve food while keeping it accessible and edible. The seawater selection was crucial. Vikings learned that seawater from different locations had different preservation properties. Deep ocean water was preferred over coastal water because it had fewer contaminants and more stable mineral content. They could identify good preservation seawater by taste, clarity, and even smell. But here's where Viking innovation really showed. They would partially evaporate seawater to increase salt concentration, creating supersaturated brines that could preserve food more effectively than regular seawater. The container systems were engineered for seawater use. Vikings used specially treated wooden barrels and ceramic vessels that could withstand constant contact with salt water without deteriorating. These containers had drainage systems that allowed seawater circulation while preventing food from floating away or becoming contaminated. The immersion techniques varied by food type. Meat was typically fully submerged in seawater brines, while fish could be preserved using partial immersion or seawater washing techniques. Vegetables required different seawater concentrations and immersion times to achieve proper preservation without becoming inedible. The scale was impressive. Seawater preservation systems could handle large quantities of food with minimal additional materials or equipment. A single seawater preservation setup could preserve hundreds of pounds of food using only materials available on any Viking ship. But seawater preservation required constant access to clean seawater and careful monitoring that wasn't always possible during inland raids or river voyages. For preservation methods that worked anywhere, Vikings turned to their fifth technique, one that used natural drying processes. Method 5. The advanced drying techniques. Vikings developed sophisticated drying methods that went far beyond simply hanging meat in the sun. They created controlled drying systems that could operate in any weather conditions and produce consistently preserved foods with extended shelf life and maintain nutritional value. The drying apparatus was engineered for ship use. Vikings built drying racks and chambers that could operate safely aboard wooden vessels while providing optimal airflow and temperature control. These systems used the ship's natural ventilation and movement to create ideal drying conditions. But the real innovation was in their multi-stage drying process. Vikings didn't just dry food once. They used sequential drying techniques that removed moisture in stages, preventing spoilage while maintaining food quality. Initial rapid drying removed surface moisture, while slower secondary drying removed deep moisture without damaging food structure. The preparation techniques were sophisticated and systematic. Vikings would pre-treat foods with salt, spices, or other additives that improved drying effectiveness and final preservation quality. The timing was precisely calculated for different foods. Vikings knew exactly how long different types of food needed to dry for optimal preservation. Meat required 3 to 5 days for proper drying, while fish could be dried in 1 to 2 days. Vegetables and grains had their own specific drying requirements. The production capacity was substantial. Viking drying systems could process large quantities of food simultaneously, creating preserved food supplies that could sustain crews for months of voyaging and raiding. But drying took several days to complete, time that wasn't always available during active raiding campaigns. For rapid preservation methods, Vikings developed their sixth technique, one that could preserve food in hours rather than days. Method 6. The rapid fat rendering preservation. Vikings discovered that rendered animal fat could be used as a rapid preservation medium that could preserve meat and other foods in just a few hours, while creating high-energy food supplies that were perfect for active raiding and exploration. This technique produced what was essentially the world's first energy bars, concentrated nutrition that could sustain warriors during intense physical activity. The fat rendering process was sophisticated and systematic. Vikings would render fat from various animals, seals, whales, cattle, and pigs, using controlled heating techniques that produce clean, pure fat suitable for food preservation. Different animal fats had different preservation properties and were used for specific applications. Some fat-preserved foods were designed for immediate consumption and provided quick energy, while others were created for long-term storage and could last for years. The nutritional benefits were remarkable. Fat-preserved foods provided concentrated calories and essential nutrients that sustained Vikings during periods of intense physical activity. These foods were particularly valuable during raiding campaigns when crews needed maximum energy and nutrition. Preparation for consumption was straightforward. Fat-preserved foods could be eaten directly or prepared through simple heating or cooking techniques. Vikings developed various methods for preparing fat-preserved foods into palatable, nutritious meals. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking food preservation was how all 6 methods worked together as an integrated system that could sustain crews during the longest and most challenging voyages in maritime history. Historical records show that properly provisioned Viking ships could remain at sea for 6 to 8 months without resupplying, far longer than other vessels of the same period. This capability was crucial to Viking success in exploration, trade, and warfare across vast distances. The techniques were so effective that they influenced food preservation practices throughout Northern Europe and beyond. Other cultures adopted Viking preservation methods, and many principles can still be seen in traditional Scandinavian foods today. The story of how Vikings preserved food aboard their ships reveals something profound about human ingenuity and the foundations of exploration. When faced with the challenge of keeping crews fed and healthy during months-long voyages across dangerous seas, Vikings didn't just survive, but they created food preservation systems that were centuries ahead of their time. And this is only half the story of their survival. After all, even the best cured meat and fish wouldn't matter if the crew had nothing safe to drink. That's why their other great innovation, turning seawater into fresh drinking water, was just as vital. To see how they pulled off this impossible feat, make sure to watch our next video.